that I would like to thank Sala and Maria for kind of setting me up. Sala, I have some of the same questions you have. I think they're extremely important ones. And I also agree with Maria that I wonder really whether we can come up with a single way to really theorize about translation and theories of translation. That trying to think about this problem, I mean, it's one thing to sit here and talk about it, but when you really try to write about it, it's like trying to solve the mind-body problem, you know, in terms of its difficulty. And so what I decided to do for this particular presentation was to actually look at embedded practices and try to establish whether or not the way that complexity works in particular practices can shed some kind of light on those practices and perhaps theories of translation, or again, I don't want to say a theory of translation, but rather theories of translation. What I'd like to do is type digital humanities. And that in digital humanities, we can think of a general type of complexity. And here I'm thinking about the complexity of information processing. And Maria made some allusion to that in her talk. I would say that it's characterized, and Kobus used this term himself, procedures and models of information representation and flow. And here we get into the problem of representation and modeling that Sala brought up in certain ways. So we have to take this into consideration as well. And when we think about, let's say, the role of complexity theory in the digital humanities, with particular mention of translation, complexity theory articulates and makes aspects of translation explicit. So in many ways, what is going on here is, do I still have them? Okay, am I okay? Fine. That what we're trying to do is something akin to what some people in logic have done, and that is try to make natural language explicit. In particular, there's a philosopher by the name of Robert Brandom at the University of Pittsburgh who has done a lot of work in trying to really unite pragmatism in certain aspects of analytic philosophy. Now, let's talk about comparative humanities for just a minute. Here, what we're talking about is, again, something that Maria made allusion to, and also, I think, Sala, in his questions, in many ways implied. And here we're talking about complexity of interaction and categorization across domains of discourse. And when I talk about comparative humanities, let me just expound on that for just a minute. I'm thinking about some of the work that's being done in global history, that Jeanette, you and I were talking about that earlier, comparative philosophy, also world literature system analysis, all are movements which we find in the comparative humanities movement. And in fact, history departments now are really moving towards embracing a kind of comparative humanities methodology. So again, what we're looking at in the historical domain, and increasingly younger scholars are thinking in these terms, is they consider the interaction of various types of linguistic groups. Characterized here, we're looking at heterogeneity and homogeneity, and that these are the forces of constraints that Kobus was talking about a little bit earlier. Role of complexity theory, and again, I allude to some of Kobus's work here. Complexity theory accounts for diverse, uniform, and contingent relationships that characterize translation. So we have that role of contingency that is working in this particular practice. Remember, these are practices. They're domains of discourse. I should add that I was very much influenced by reading of Kant when I was young. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is trying to limit set domains. And I'm using the idea of these concrete practices in humanities as a way to do this. Now, to turn to the digital humanities on your handout, what I have here is a Venn diagram. And I use this particular Venn diagram to inform the establishment of digital humanities on my campus. And as we can see here, what I do and what I have conceived the digital humanities, and we're going to just concentrate on the digital humanities. The comparative humanities would be a separate lecture which would last about 2 hours. But I think I can dispatch the digital humanities, you're thinking mercifully, in about 10, 15 minutes. That we have these various components that we can find within what I call the digital humanities, something which I call information humanities, something which I call cognitive humanities, something I call computation humanities. And here, one of the things that I insist on is that the digital humanities interacts with a kind of culture of critique and criticism. Again, this could be a role for semiotics and for translation studies as well. And again, you know, when we look at these particular fields as a transdisciplinary field in a lot of ways, there's interaction within, between each of these fields. There's intersections. There are places where they are considered to be completely separate from each other. And then there's a larger kind of disciplinary ecology in which digital humanities, as we've conceived it, operates. Now, to just specify what I was doing, information humanities really deals with the question, how is information presented, curated, and disseminated? And so we're very much dealing with the organization of information here within the digital humanities. So the kinds of things that, Annalise, you were talking about what your husband does at UB, where you're talking about digital archiving, curating, things like that. I consider, or digital media, media studies, I consider that to be information humanities. The computational humanities is more along the lines of something that David was bringing up in his questions about machine translation. And that is what procedures, algorithmic procedures, should be used to transform information. And then finally, with cognitive humanities, how is information represented in human mental operations? All of these, again, have aspects of translation and complexity working within them. So let's take the information humanities first. Okay. And I'm thinking, again, let's make this relevant to the process of translation. We're dealing with texts. And I would like to say that when we're talking about information presentation, the type of complexity we're oftentimes thinking of is textual complexity. And Maria made some points about this, which I think were very, very valuable. That what's the format? How are we storing? What's the differences between one language and another? Let's think also oral versus written. All of these are going to have a special type of importance for anyone doing translation studies within this particular digital domain. So again, we're going to want to deal with methodology, storing, source of is the text widely distributed? What is the medium of formatted distribution? I'd like to add two other things that we need to talk about, which are very important for translation studies with respect to this aspect of digital humanities. The first one is the use of what we call ontologies or knowledge description frameworks. There are groups of people, as you probably know, working in translation studies who are primarily computer scientists. And these folks, what they want to do is effectively turn translation into a kind of business system. And so what they want to be able to do is specify what are the requirements for representing a text or something else that would be in that source environment, and then what would be the procedures going on to the computational humanities for transferring that text into a target text. The other thing is, and I suggested this at the that wonderful conference that Maria made allusion to a little bit earlier, we could conceive of, and we already are conceiving of, a new type of textuality. And this is a kind of answer I have to Apter and people of who follow Emily Apter's work, and that is we have hypertextuality, which in itself has a level of complexity in terms of the network articulation. For those of you who are in the Nida domain, maybe we need to rethink the Bible in some respects and have multimedia translations. And again, one of the things going along with what you're interested, Kobus, where you're interested in nonverbal, you know, that the text becomes nonverbal and the translation then is embedded within that digital document, and we can have that translation come forward into another digital format. Okay, moving right along. Computational humanities. Now, oh, here's a lot of words, as my students would say. You should have expected this out of me, being a computer scientist. Now, it's characterized by what I call algorithmic complexity and its modeling potential. And so this really fits squarely into the area that Kobus identified as theory of complexity. That is what computer scientists are primarily interested in. Now, what I do is I actually break this down into two tasks. And again, Maria made some allusion to the tasks of translation. The first task, when we think about complexity here, is the translation task. What algorithms should be used to transform a source text into a target text? This is your problem, David. Okay, what should we use? There are several forms that we have right now. rule-based, which try to model the domain knowledge of an expert. By the way, these are fairly discredited, these rule-based. A lot of the these can take these particular forms. I mentioned rule-based already. Black box-based are just brute statistical algorithms that it just so happens that they work. Crowd-based, what you use is the wisdom of the crowd to, let's say, tag a particular word, and you take the aggregation of that group, and they decide how a particular word should be translated. And then finally, we have these deep learning model-based, which involved various types of network analysis, which unfortunately I don't have time to get into here. Now, this previous task of modeling leads to something which I think is extremely important in considering whether or not we can use computational humanities in translation studies. And this is the so-called simulation task. So what we do is, sure, we have an effective translation. We might even make money off of it. But what we also want to be able to do is capture some of those operations that Maria made allusion to earlier involving neuronal firing and the like. And so what we want to be able to do in the area of artificial intelligence is not just make a good translation, but what we want to be able to do is make some sort of claim about the mind and human activity. How do we do this? And again, Sally, I think some of your questions about modeling are very appropriate here. We have to start thinking about a simulation of some type or another. Now, cognitive humanities, and Maria really did address a lot of those questions. That here we're talking about complexity found in modeling biological organisms. And you heard from Maria already talking quite a bit about this. Also, social organizations. So one of the things that people want to do in the digital humanities is not just simulate brains, but also simulate social organizations. A lot of work's being done right now on agent architectures, trying to build artificial societies. And one of the things that would be a very interesting task for somebody in the digital humanities is to go ahead and try to model networks of translators and the kind of thing that Maria was talking about with respect to varieties of translators. So we're not just talking here about individual cognition, we're also talking about social organization as well. And again, just to make a quick comment, you basically on the handout have these areas set up in the chevron sequence of events that you see at the bottom of the page with the questions that are associated with each one. So when we start thinking about this, machine simulations can, but again, we get into this problem of modeling, and that's why this is so difficult, as both Maria and Sala have already said. They can, but not necessarily lead to individual cognition. So we can ask the question, how does an individual's mind accomplish the translation task? Can we model it, okay? And can complexity theory help us understand that modeling process? Then we get into the larger question, which both of our respondents today have made allusion to, and that is this larger social world. That is, how do systems of agents engage in the complexity of translation to accomplish their tasks? And again, I think that the digital humanities in its computational and cognitive manifestations can perhaps, again, as embedded practices, help us understand a little bit about what's going on here. Again, like Maria, I'm somewhat skeptical of a single succinct general theory. But I'm like Neurath's raft in the ocean, that I'm building the raft while I'm kind of moving along, and that's part of the problem with trying to work on these theories of translation and complexity. Let me just close by talking about some future prospects. Okay, I'm sorry I couldn't talk about the comparative humanities, and I kind of gave it really short shrift. And I think probably most of the people in this room are more interested in the comparative humanities, comparative history, comparative literature, and the like, than some of the things I've been talking about with respect to the digital humanities. But the question is, of course, you know, can these sets of practices be linked? And I think that's an important question. What I've given you basically here is a quasi-Kantian phenomenal noumenal, or if you're into the philosophy of Wilfrid Sellars, scientific and manifest image dichotomy. And the question, of course, and this is a huge one, and people who are philosophically inclined like Sala, you can make this point. How do we link these domains? How do we link these domains? And what I'd like to suggest is that Kobus is quite right about the role of semiotics. Where I might differ from you, okay, is that instead of seeing semiotics as this unifying architectural feature that can link all of these activities together, that it works at the level of what I would call local integration of these fields. So that when you start thinking about cognition, let's get back to Maria's point. You are thinking, it seems to me, again, about symbols and signs and the like. This could perhaps lead then into a kind of bridge to some of the concerns that we have in the comparative humanities. That is, trying to understand different literatures, for example, or, and Jeanette, we had this conversation during the break, understanding the transfer of religious mentality across the Atlantic during the colonial period. What are those linkages? And can they be mediated by semiotics, which in turn can be articulated in some sort of digital humanities framework? All right. So my role, or the use I see as semiotics, is a bit deflationary. And I think it's deflationary because, to be frank with you, the prospects of trying to get our minds around complexity theory and translation are daunting, to say the least. One of the problems that I find is that we have this problem of attention, that, again, Maria made some allusion to this as well. You attend to complexity, but then you forget the translation. You attend to translation, but then you forget the complexity. So what I'm advocating is a more practice-oriented and perhaps a more piecemeal approach to trying to accomplish this task with respect to what Kobus has very, very wonderfully proposed. This project of trying to bring complexity and translation together to form some sort of interesting theory. Okay, I think we should I think it's time we hear from Kobus, on some of how you feel about some of our thoughts.